In 2018, Home Secretary Sajid Javid announced the Home Office review into grooming gangs. It was a big moment. A British Muslim minister was brave enough to look at whether Pakistani men really were overrepresented as abusers. But in the aftermath of the Windrush scandal, the department was hypersensitive about race and did its best to block the report's publication. It took 130,000 signing a petition for it to be released. But the report was a whitewash. It limply concluded that data collection on ethnicity was so poor that it was impossible to know the truth. Rather than improve data collection, it said that the majority of abusers were white. However, the report it based that on found that 30% of abusers were white and 28% were Asian, despite whites making up 85% of the population and Asians just 8%. Clearly, Asians were vastly overrepresented in this kind of child abuse, being over 3 times more likely to be an abuser.
You're watching Deprogrammed. My name's Harrison Pitt, I'm a writer for the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and our special guest Charlie Peters, who is a presenter at GB News. And recently, Charlie, you've produced this documentary for GB News on what's in common parlance referred to as the grooming gangs phenomenon, but really we're talking about the sort of the systematic rape, exploitation, and brutalization of children at the hands of sort of predominantly Pakistani gangs. What's been the reaction to that documentary in the echelons of power?
Well, it's changed the law, first and foremost. That's the most important thing to know, is that it worked. We had 2 intentions when we made the film. It's just me and one producer, of course with the support of GB News and the various assistants it has provided. The mission was to restart a national conversation we never had when this problem started, or it was noticed by the mainstream just over a decade ago. The reporter at the Times, Andrew Norfolk, he kind of exposed the scandal originally in Rotherham, and then news has filtered through from other towns and other court records across the country to point to this being a national crisis. But as that discussion started, it was mealy-mouthed, it was minute, and it was heavily censored. And so I wanted to restart that, and I also wanted to investigate whether it was still going on today. We found that it was, and we also hoped to, in part of restarting that conversation, commit some change, and gave a series of recommendations, many of which the government picked up on in their change in the law earlier this month.
And what were those policies in particular?
Well, we said that the government needed to take a look at ethnicity data and hold the police and the government itself to account on recording ethnicity data. There has been a nervousness in discussing that issue within these abuse gangs. We also wanted stronger prison sentences for the grooming gang abusers, so facilitators of this sort of abuse should be punished further. All too often in the stories that we looked at, men were committing the most obscene acts and facilitating the abuse of others, and were released from prison after only a few years, often spending some time in open prisons, often returning to the same communities that their victims lived in. So that was the second big piece that we wanted. And then we also wanted a national crime agency supported and led task force. So the police could investigate areas where they believed or had credible reason that these abuse gangs were still operating. There are several such towns where insufficient investigation has taken place. And we know from Rotherham, the National Crime Agency has secured dozens of more prosecutions and is still working to secure justice for more survivors. We saw it as sort of, in our analysis, the gold standard organisation for achieving justice within the grooming gang scandal. All too often, local government and local police forces were mired in political correctness and a failure to adequately respond to these issues. But a national, kind of separate and, I think, more expert force could deliver the justice
tailored to this particular problem.
That's right. So that's what we've got.
So maybe it's just because I'm a stranger in a strange land here, but why has this taken so long? Like, what, political correctness aside, where is this nervousness coming from? Because it seems to me that in any sort of civilized society, the sort of mass industrial rape of young girls and women should be taken with the utmost seriousness.
Yeah.
And it seems from watching your documentary that the only thing that's been taken seriously is the desire to hide all of this and push it under the rug.
I think the overarching crisis we've had with this problem has been the prioritization of community cohesion over the safety and security of young girls. That is the prioritisation of defending multiculturalism as a whole and the missions of liberalism and the sustenance of its justification in policy and in practice over young women and girls who are generally considered to be expendable by those people. I mean, this is a multifaceted issue. It's not just about nervousness about ethnicity, it's also about not caring about girls who are seen not really as working class but sort of underclass. And many people in the media, and I believe in politics as well, and local authorities, were happy for those girls to be characterised in that way, that they were out of control, wild girls, getting themselves into trouble. But actually, the model of grooming is such that these girls are dragged away, isolated, toxically abused, twisted, and in many cases tortured as they go through their horrifying ordeals. So those are the two big reasons why I think that has happened. Also, what has generated this nervousness and this hostility towards the truth and a prevention of investigation has been that it's been going on for so many decades. And the only people who were willing to speak about it in the beginning were those typically considered far right, often just normal people with normal concerns. Obviously, it's a tag that's used very, very casually. When patriotic and socially conservative and decent and upstanding left-wing people made comments or complaints about this scandal,
They were thrown out the Labour Party.
They were just bullied and harassed and destroyed. Anne Cryan, the Labour MP, in 2003 first made public concerns about the first, I can tell, left-wing figure to kind of stand up against this issue. And she was just ignored. In fact, the journalist who eventually exposed the scandal, Andrew Norfolk, wrote one story at the time in 2003 where he said that he felt that this was a sort of a far-right fantasy. He himself admitted that. But a sense of kind of liberal guilt kicked in over the years and he revisited the issue. And so we can credit Anna Cryer a lot with actually starting that investigation. Jack Straw, he also made complaints. He was pilloried, and very famously Sarah Champion, of course, writing in 2018 for The Sun about this scandal, was subject to the most obscene bullying and obviously removed from frontline politics of the Labour Party and hasn't really come back since.
So are you optimistic then that these political changes that you've been able to kind of push through will be upheld if and when Labour gets into power?
The more concerning thing about the political changes that have happened, first I'd say it's very brave of the Prime Minister and the government and Suella Braverman to take this on, because it has become such a difficult issue for others to do. I mean, it sounds almost ludicrous to say that it's brave to support
stand up against
rape gangs, but because there is such a huge vilification of anyone who does do it, I'm enormously grateful that they have done it, and we should all be, I think. It's no small thing to be faced with kind of an onslaught of abuse and just to say, this is worth doing. What concerns me the most about the security and long-standing support of those policies was how frit their colleagues were in defending them. Suella Braverman took the hardest line any politician has when she announced on the Sunday before the policies were put to the nation, describing in no uncertain terms that these gangs are predominantly British Pakistani, that there has been a kind of a cultural and ethnic cause to this abuse, that white girls were targeted for their race, and that there was a clannishness that supported and led towards that kind of abuse.
How did that clannishness manifest itself? So give us some examples of why that makes this problem so intractable.
Migration to Britain has happened in waves, in many ways, in the last 5 decades or so, but more intensely from kind of South Asia, and since kind of the Windrush scandal as well. The Windrush generation, of course. What we have struggled with in particular with assimilating migrants from northern Pakistan and the Mir-Puri region in particular is that chain migration happens within families, and then the cultural attitudes of people from that region are such that cousin marriage is very common, and this generates socio-biological kinship whereby you create clans through consanguinity. If you marry your family, you don't assimilate with the rest of the community. It creates ghettoization, and this mixed in with a deeply patriarchal culture, which in many ways is extremely backward, gives girls and women very little power, and it gives men enormous opportunity to act kind of without repercussion.
And so these extreme levels of in-group solidarity and sort of out-group hostility and out-group suspicion it means that sort of cousins aren't willing to inform on one another to police, or the local police force, even if they are trying, obviously as you say, often they're very neglectful, but even if they are trying to solve this problem, it's very difficult to infiltrate into that those sort of cousinage networks.
Precisely, spot on. And at the same time, you have to remember that the in-group solidarity, as it were, of the local long-standing population is declining at the same time. In many of these towns, they are kind of post-industrial Victorian industrial towns, very atomized and blighted by sweeping changes in society, which have made them poorer, less united. Changes in cultural attitudes have seen a rise. I mean, a lot of disputes happening in the 90s and the early noughties was during a period of like a sudden change in the licentiousness of our culture. Going out and having a kind of a very liberal sex life was considered normal. So this change happening in tandem, this very, very conservative and abusive culture, mixing it with a bizarre, I mean, I grew up in the noughties, you saw it, I mean, you might have as well, right? You would have seen how this bizarre mixture of conservative judgment from tabloid press mixed in with the promotion of licentiousness through popular media would have been very, very confusing to lots of young women and young girls growing up at the time.
I think you mentioned earlier how one of the reasons why this was swept under the rug by left-wing authorities in particular is because it sort of flew in the face of their own sort of ideological pieties, their sort of delusions. But I think it does also, and if we're speaking about the left in that case, but I think it also, and I'll get to that in a second, but I think it also undermines the classical liberal illusion that it's possible for us simply to value freedom in politics and expect that you can have sort of relentless waves of sort of unwanted migration into these communities and expect that it's not going to lead to a sort of disintegration of social bonds. It's not going to create problems for social cohesion. And obviously that sort of economic liberalism has seized the upper echelons of the Conservative Party ever since Thatcher, really. So it flies in the face of that sort of liberal piety, but it also flies in the face of the much more sort of much more ideological left-wing piety that not only is diversity not a problem, it's an active strength, and that we wouldn't even need to have scandals like this to underline how wrong that is. I mean, any place in the world where you look, where there are sort of extreme levels of diversity, I think the three most, and obviously there are all sorts of different fault lines along which diversity can be measured. You get tribal diversity, you get ethnic diversity, you get racial diversity, you get religious diversity. All of the places where diversity is at its highest proportion. I think the three most diverse populations of the world, with populations of over 1 million, are Liberia, the Congo, and Papua New Guinea. Not exactly success stories. And the three most homogenous societies in the world are Japan, Denmark, and South Korea. So the gamble of the diversities is our strength crowd is that the more we become compositionally like Liberia, like the Congo, like Papua New Guinea, the more we can retain our sort of the more we can retain the first world standards of countries like South Korea, Japan, and Denmark, and it's sheer delusion. And so it's no wonder that when you get a sort of a story like this, which just completely blows that illusion to shreds, they don't want anything to do with it.
Sure. I mean, you can take, I think Singapore is the only example of a kind of modern first world multi-ethnic society that's kind of come up, in Lee Kuan Yew's book, From Third World to First. It's multiculturalism is built into the Singaporean constitution, but that was done with laws that would probably not fly here in Westminster.
I was just about to, sorry, continue.
No, and I would just say, I'm even kind of a good example of this, because assimilation will only get you so far. I mean, I'm from a Commonwealth country, I'm Canadian, I speak English, I've moved here, I love it here, but I'm not British, clearly.
You have the same nursery rhymes as us.
Yeah, exactly.
The same monarch as us.
I'm about as close as you can get, but I'm still not British. And so the idea that, as assimilated as I might become, it'll never be 100%. And the idea that somebody can come here, from a country like Liberia, they might be well accepted, they might be, they can learn to speak English, and they might be economically productive, but they'll never become English. Maybe their children's children could kind of get there, but this idea that everybody will just come here and sort of immediately meld into a melting pot. If it's not going to work for Canadians and Australians, where will it?
I think the dominant culture will always sustain, but I think that all good countries need a degree of migration to stay dynamic and also to generally enhance their culture. It's not necessarily the case that just that migration dilutes and denigrates it. It can enhance too. The problem, especially in many of these towns covered in the film and in the wider investigation, is that it was too much, too soon, too fast,
and unwanted, and not voted for.
And nobody asked for it. And nobody asked for it.
For the exact opposite thing.
It is a usurpation of the government's powers to, because a lot of these people sort of once people become here as immigrants, in 5 years' time they will become voters. They'll be on the voter rolls. It is sheer arrogance on the part of our elites to import effectively a new electorate without the consent of the existing one, and that's something which has been happening consistently for decades now. And obviously, it manifests itself most aggressively and most violently in the sort of problems that you're talking about. Sorry, do you want to say something?
I just think on the politics of dealing with this issue, there was one man in particular during the investigation that we covered that sort of encapsulated the crisis as a whole, for me at least. His name's Maruf Hussain. Now, he was the Community Cohesion Minister for Rotherham Council until 2015, when he was forced to resign after Baroness Casey wrote a report, an inspection of Rotherham Council, which found that it was in denial, and she held the leadership accountable for all that. She said the majority of councillors did not accept the J report published a year earlier, which found that 1,400 girls had been abused from 1997 to 2013.
How many, sorry?
1,400. That number has since been revised up to 1,510 by the National Crime Agency.
This is in Rotherham.
That's in Rotherham alone. Now, Rotherham has a relatively small population of British Pakistanis, less than 5% of the town, and it's a town of about 140,000. But they constituted the vast majority of grooming gang suspects. They were also aided by some white women as well, who acted as facilitators. Some of them actually converts to Islam. One woman in particular, Shafina Ali, who sadly died in 2009, so escaped the justice that she very much deserved, facilitated a fake taxi hotline for taking girls to school, and worked with some abusers. And I've met survivors of her crimes. Now, Maruf Hussain, after resigning in 2015 in disgrace, we found through the GB News investigation that he had since managed to sneak back into the public sector after rebranding himself as an anti-Islamophobia activist. So the Casey report found that it alleged that Maruf Hussain had delivered a false accusation of racism against a fellow Labour Party member, when that Labour Party member said there is a particular problem with Pakistani taxi drivers in this town abusing white girls, which was obviously true, and as we know has been very much proven. Mr. Hussain's reaction to that comment, it is said in the case report, was this is racist, and to complain about it. So he was very much, in his role, prioritising community cohesion over the safety and the support that young girls in the town needed. He then, after his resignation, went through a period of rebranding as an anti-Islamophobia activist, as a sort of community cohesion activist. And we found at the beginning of the year that he was now working as a manager in the NHS Health Education England body as a national diversity, inclusion and participation manager.
These people get paid quite a bit.
I think he was on £49,000 when I asked them politely for his salary, and they begrudgingly told me. So he had used the kind of the language, the trappings and the politics of diversity, firstly to help the cover up of abuse, and then to advance his own career in the wake of the disaster he left behind. As far as I'm concerned, people who were involved in that should not face freedom again.
No.
Let alone rebrand themselves as public servants. It's
I think it's a disgrace that diversity hasn't been more of a casualty of this scandal, and instead, it still sounds like it's still a lucrative selling point for many people.
In many ways, the diversity industry has benefited from the national grooming gang scandal.
Why do you say that?
Because it has shown to us, in no uncertain terms, the enormous power of lying to people about the truth about these crimes. And it has shown to grifters and activists and lawyers and media professionals and politicians that if they repeat a lie enough about this scandal, not only can they get away with it, but they can be promoted for it. It has shown, in many ways, very disturbingly, the invincibility that the diversity industry and the diversity culture enjoys within our politics. The reaction to the film was very positive from people who had not heard about the issue before, or many who had and were keen to see some more support. Yeah, but a lot of people ignored it because it's not in keeping with the national myth making we've had around this crisis. In 2020, the Home Office were forced to release a report which said that the majority of grooming gang abusers are white. That's actually not what the report said. It found that so many constabularies didn't have data,
Hence the law change.
And so it was impossible to know the truth. And it said that 30% of white men were abusers and 28% were Asian. That's unlikely to represent the truth because of the lack of data. But even then, that shows a huge overrepresentation of Asians and an underrepresentation of white men. But still, the blob and the diversity industry managed to spin that report as saying, grooming gangs are a white problem, even though we had 19 trials in West Yorkshire of only Pakistani men, even though we had Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, even though we had up to 50 different towns and cities where these gangs had gone on, and where in general Asian, but in particular Pakistani names were most common. More recently, studies have been done analysing prosecution data, which has found that Pakistanis dominate this conversation, dominate this data. So even if the police aren't recording the ethnicity of the abusers, the courts are recording their names, and using some academic analysis there, we can show that the blob is lying. But the blob doesn't care. The blob hears it and goes, no, that's racist. Syed Avasi will say, you're racist. The Guardian will say, you're racist. Elements of the government will tell you you're racist. And Suella Braverman, I think, was quite surprised by the reaction she got. I think she underestimated the extent to which people cannot let this truth be known.
Now, forgive my ignorance here, but obviously Europe saw like a mass migration wave in 2015, right? And there were problems that came from that. Like in Germany, they had
Dortmund and Cologne.
Yes, exactly. But there seems to me to be like a systematic element in the UK that isn't present in other countries that have had the same problem. It's like in your documentary, you talk about a list of girls' names that was pinned to a door, and it's rife through the police. It's people taking advantage of black cabs and using a fake call-in service. Why do you think there's this element of, I don't know, like collaboration and like, for lack of a better word, like high intelligence in planning it that's happening in the UK that doesn't seem to be happening in other countries. Other countries, there's problems,
it's
but there's
spontaneous.
It's just attacks.
Like
I'd say that Syria is not the same as the Mirpuri region of Pakistan or the Kashmir region of Pakistan. They're different people, different cultures, different worlds, and so it's not the same source, as it were, of the issue that we have predominantly in England and Wales, and also in Glasgow. Actually, there was one grooming gang scandal in Glasgow. So you're dealing with different people, but also I think England has a particular nervousness about discussions of immigration and discussions of, and people are particularly nervous about being seen as racist, right? The fear of being seen as racist was repeated regularly in all of the reports. The Telford report last year mentioned that racial nervousness led to civil servants in the local government like shutting down discussions of it, even like well-meaning people, normal people, so wrapped up in this culture of political correctness that they would actively commit to policy decisions that harmed girls and protected abusers. So I think our culture is very upsetting, particularly warped in this way, whereas kind of friendly and similar countries that aren't as bad on that front and also haven't had the same kind of migration.
I think that's the second bit is very important. I don't just want to keep bashing diversity, but I mean it gets a lot of celebration, so there's a corrective element, I suppose, to it. But I think diversity also, I mean, at extremely high levels, like mass immigration, it has a sort of paralysing effect on freedom of speech, particularly for politicians who now have to court the votes of these new arrivals, particularly if they live in constituencies where they predominate. So, for example, in the 1870s, there were examples of Gladstone making speeches against the Turkish Empire, which would have him thrown out of every single mainstream political party today. The only party that would accept him today would be either sort of Reclaim or Reform, maybe the SDP, even though he would have disagreed with them on free trade. I mean, some of the stuff fulminating against sort of Turkish atrocities in Bulgaria, being very disparaging about the Muslim faith and the way in which that motivates those sorts of atrocities. But if he'd had a large sort of Turkish diaspora in his Greenwich constituency, would Gladstone have been anywhere near as fearsome in going against that? And as such today, I mean, the same problem persists. If you've got these sort of diasporas living in communities, you're going to have to tread incredibly carefully. So diversity has a sort of a paralysing effect on free speech and our ability to get to the heart of issues as well.
I think you're right, but I mean, unfortunately, we don't have to look as far back as the 1870s to prove it today. I mean,
Just a very good example.
Yeah, well, it is. we have to only look back 3 weeks ago when Tracy Brabin was the mayor for West Yorkshire, was on the Sunday Politics show on the BBC. I forget what it's called now. Laura Kuenssberg was hosting, and the night before, Suella Brabin had written her op-ed published at 10:30 p.m. saying that the government will act to clamp down on grooming gangs. So announcing the first communications line on the new policy. Tracy Brabin, I think, was unprepared for this, but her reaction to how to describe her response to Braverman's comments was very telling. Her first reaction was to describe it as dog whistle politics. So not to actually grapple with the validity of the claim, but to say on national television, this is a dog whistle, the truth is a dog whistle. But we also have to remember that Bravin's comments come within 2 years of the scandal in Batley, where a teacher is still in hiding after the issue of displaying a cartoon of Muhammad or a photo of Muhammad.
For pedagogical purposes.
Indeed, for the purpose of teaching, right? That was, this man is still in hiding, I believe, and probably under lock and key with MI5 right now, God bless him. And mere weeks before this announcement in March, you'll remember that there was an incident in Wakefield where an autistic boy dropped a Quran at school.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And he was forced to apologise. His mother was dragged in front of a
terrified,
a Sharia come Maoist struggle session.
Well, there we go. We saw that there was, in many cases, the political and social calamities that contribute to the grooming gang scandal were there before us. A police officer, an inspector in West Yorkshire Police, sat there in front of this crowd saying, I urge calm from the local community, the local Muslim community, with regards to this poor autistic boy and his mother, who was begging for forgiveness from these people, embarrassing, awful people. I would say that West Yorkshire Police, a police force that had Maruf Hussain, the aforementioned Islamophobia activist, very helpfully gave them a talk in 2019, and we uncovered at GB News. So a man who covered up grooming gangs was now speaking to the police about diversity. So Tracy Brabin, in her own patch, has got to balance these competing and totally alien forces, and so she cannot. She's politically restricted from being honest, I think, about this problem. She'll allow a teacher to go into hiding. She'll allow an autistic boy to be bullied by a fanatic religious mob, and she will fail to stand up for girls being abused by the most obscene, torturous rape gangs. The question has to be asked, actually, what will she not cover up?
Yeah. Yes. Well, okay, so if we can't count on the politicians, what advice would you give for people kind of back at home who are trying to deal with this in their personal lives, who might be worried about their daughters or their nieces or just girls in their community?
Well, there are enormous resources available from many very good organisations with regards to how to respond to child sexual exploitation. I always refer people to the NSPCC, and I've been slightly nervous about doing that in the last month because they actually said that Braverman's comments risk singling out the group. But of course, the whole problem we've had is that people have not been singling out this group.
God forbid that we get to the heart of the problem.
Yes, indeed. So that was really quite distressing. But their overall guidance on how to respond to CSE is very important. I'd also recommend people reach out to the Maggie Oliver Foundation. Maggie Oliver, the Rochdale whistleblower who exposed the scandal there. We still don't know the extent of it. A report is currently being written by the local authority. Her foundation is remarkable, supports thousands of survivors every year, and supports active live cases where girls still feel as though they are being fobbed off by the police. And I've seen some of those case notes, and they are severe. They are doing very good work. And I think if people watch the film, as I'm sure many of your viewers already have, because your viewers are excellent people, but they will notice many other commentators and activists and whistleblowers there who need support.
And a lot of the conversation about this has to do with, kind of the Westminster class and the political response and repercussions to this. But what has been the response that you've gotten from these members of the working class, or even kind of below that, the underclass that you've been talking with? I mean, you must be kind of their hero now. You're the first person to kind of bring this up in like a decade.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think like any like sense of courage or like personal pride, I feel like this work is minute in comparison to what you hear when you meet survivors and when you speak to victims of this abuse who are putting their lives at risk to step forward and discuss it. So I feel I'm a very grateful vessel for their ideas and for their stories.
Sure.
And people are more grateful for them
Yeah.
than they are, I think, for any outlet that supports them, because they are the people who have changed the national conversation. Journalists can only help sell their stories to the public, but this might sound weird to say, but editing the voice of a survivor, editing their speech and their testimony to me is much easier than editing speaking to a commentator or a politician, because there is no waffle, there is no flapping around, there is just their experiences and the raw humanity of it. They are the people who compel people into action.
I understand that you actually interviewed Suella Braverman recently. Were you impressed?
There was one line in particular that stood out, which was stark. She said the answer to my second question. She said, "The truth is not racist." I've never heard a minister or a politician, let alone the Home Secretary, stand up for the government's own policy investigating these kind of gangs before. So I was impressed by that, but the proof is really in the pudding. If this task force is given the sufficient support it needs, then I will be impressed. If the more data on ethnicity is recorded, then I will be impressed. If abusers are deported, I'll be very impressed.
Yes, I was about to ask that. Yes.
But also if they go to prison. There was a case this morning I read about, not with to deal with the grooming gang scandal, but a man arrested for a violent offence, not sent to prison because the prisons are full. This is a problem we've had for many years. Our prison estate is absolutely heaving, and I think that we run a risk now of extremists and abusers escaping punishment due to that issue. So there's a lot to do.
Now, okay, so you hit the note there 4 times. If these things don't happen, what do you expect that the response will be, both from the communities that it's happening in and from sort of the political elements in Westminster that are trying to push through these changes?
Well, I think they are cautiously optimistic is the language I heard, essentially, when I met with many of the survivors and campaigners I've worked with for the last 18 months. Cautiously optimistic. So I don't know what their reaction would be, and I wouldn't want to preempt that, but we will be there to hold the government to account and to give those voices a voice when and if the government lets them down.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie Peters, for coming in and telling us about this, and we look forward to any future work you might have in the pipeline. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. We'll see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.